Thanks very much. Yep, thanks very much, Sunil. So I'd like to introduce Dominique. Dr. Dominique Martin is Associate Professor in Health Ethics and Professionalism in the School of Medicine at Deakin University in Australia. She's a bioethicist and former medical practitioner. Her research focuses on ethical issues in donation, transplantation, and nephrology. She's previously served as a co-chair of the Declaration of Istanbul Custodian Group and of the Ethics Committee of the Transplantation Society, and as a member of the Organ and Tissue Working Committee of the National Health and Medical Research Council in Australia. She has worked as a consultant in transplant ethics for the Australian Organ and Tissue Authority and the World Health Organization. Dominique is also a member of the Doha International Academy of Organ Donation and councillor-elect for the Transplantation Society. So over to you, Dominique.
Let me unmute myself. I am unmuted. Awesome. Thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this really important webinar series and of course to speak in this program this evening. I'm going to talk about buying and selling organs. There are of course many ethical issues that impact donation and transplantation around the world today, many of them incredibly important, incredibly complex and difficult. But organ trafficking and issues relating to commercial interests in organ donation and transplantation in particular is a really big problem. It's perhaps one where we feel that we've done a lot of ethics work, but there seems to be significant barriers to practically addressing this problem. So I'll talk a little bit about why I think buying and selling organs is unethical, and then touch on whether it really is a problem that we need to worry about today. And then I'll hand over to Dr. Nagral, who I think will talk perhaps a little bit more about the more practical side of how we address the issues. I'd like to begin, though, by acknowledging that I'm presenting this evening from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of these lands. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people who join us in this session or on whose lands you may be gathered while you're watching us later. A couple of disclosures. As David mentioned, I'm a previous co-chair of the Declaration of Istanbul Custodian Group. I've received consulting fees from the World Health Organization and the Australian Organ and Tissue Authority. That might be considered to introduce some bias into some of the points that I might be making in this session. Really important to note that any opinions that I express in this talk and in the subsequent panel discussion are very much my own and don't necessarily reflect those of any of the organisations with which I have been or am currently affiliated. So what are we talking about, or what do we mean when we talk about organ trade or trafficking? Put simply, organ trade occurs when someone exchanges human organs for something of financial value. And contrary to some of the movies that people might have seen, this doesn't always involve someone handing over a bag of cash for an esky with an organ, on ice in it. The term organ trafficking, I'm sure legal scholars would probably suggest, is usually used to refer to activities that have been legally criminalised. But I think in everyday sort of parlance, when we're talking about these issues, people tend to use the words trade and trafficking a little interchangeably, and I'm afraid I'm going to do that in the course of this talk. I do want to draw your attention, though, to a really important definition of organ trafficking. This quote here is from the 2018 edition of the Declaration of Istanbul, and it's almost word for word derived from a definition in the Convention Against Trafficking in Human Organs of the Council of Europe. What it makes clear in this definition is that it's not just that exchange of organs for money. It comprises a range of activities that may directly or indirectly support or facilitate or be associated with the exchange of organs for some kind of financial profit. The reason why new definitions of organ trafficking emerged in the last decade was to try and capture the range of activities that could underpin trafficking and trade practices. And these include removing organs from living or deceased donors without valid consent or authorization, doing so in exchange for financial gain or comparable advantage, recognizing that it's not always a direct cash payment, but everything from soliciting and recruiting donors or recipients with the goal of doing so for financial gain, attempting to commit, aiding or abetting this whole range of acts. And that's just a very nice pictorial representation of that definition prepared by Dr. Marta Lopez Fraga from the Council of Europe, I like drawing attention to the activities because I think it's really important that we don't focus on the people who supply the organs in the sense of the organ seller or donor, or even the people who purchase them for transplantation, the recipients. They are important people. Of course, we need to focus on their well-being. We need to focus on their involvement in trafficking. But if we don't pay attention to all the other activities that actually support the mechanism, the market, we won't actually be able to capture all of the ethical concerns nor to address them. A brief definition, transplant tourism, a term that is usually used in conjunction with that of organ trafficking. When we talk about travel for transplantation, a more neutral term, we're referring simply to travel for transplantation to another jurisdiction, usually another country. When we say transplant tourism, at least as defined by the Declaration of Istanbul, we're talking about that kind of travel for transplantation that involves organ trafficking or which may be detrimental to the efforts of a country to which people travel to meet their own needs for transplantation, so undermining self-sufficiency in the destination country. Oftentimes when you read media stories about it or you attend perhaps a transplant ethics talk, people will talk about organ trafficking as if it's something that almost exclusively or primarily happens in the context of transplant tourism. So stories of wealthy Westerners flying to developing countries to buy organs from the poor, for example. That certainly happens, and it has happened on a large scale, and it is certainly still happening, we believe, in probably significant numbers. But I suspect that the majority of organ trafficking is actually happening in the context of domestic markets. And that's why it's important to pay attention to transplant tourism, but not to assume that if we stop or we slow down transplant tourism, we're actually dealing with the big problem of organ trafficking. So what's unethical about trade in organs? There are lots and lots of things that I could say about this topic, but I've tried to restrict myself to some generalities. If we focus on particular types of categories of ethical concern with regards to trade in organs, we might think of the first category as being violations of autonomy, and usually we're concerned with the autonomy of living donors or organ sellers. So people may be coerced, that is physically forced or threatened. They might be manipulated or deceived in order to supply their organs. They might have their organs taken from them without their consent. Perhaps most commonly in the market for kidneys from living donors, we see that people are deceived and manipulated in the sense that they are not adequately informed of what the procedure involves, what the medical risks are, and they're often deceived about the amount of money they will be paid for their organs. We also worry a lot about harmful consequences, and they may be the harms or the risks associated with selling one's organ, being a supplier or a donor, but also the harms that can result to the families of donors, their communities, and the recipients of transplants where that involves a trafficked organ. There are several factors that underpin the high rates of harm occurring to organ sellers and to the recipients of trafficked organs. They include, but are not limited to, failure to adequately screen prospective organ sellers, failure to exclude donors, so to speak, who are at high risk either of complications for themselves or of transmitting a disease or leading to poorer outcomes in the transplant recipients. There's also a failure to provide adequate perioperative care and follow-up care for donors, and also sometimes for transplant recipients. And we know that there are long-term poor outcomes for people who sell their kidneys, but also sometimes parts of their livers on the market. That can be due to the fact that they don't receive a great deal of money. It can be due to the impact of the procedure on their health, their employment prospects, as well as stigmatization and more. We can also think of a category of ethical concerns as those relating to injustice. That most obviously is when we see the exploitation of vulnerable individuals, particularly poor people, people with poor health literacy, who agree to unfair deals. It also is something that even if we were in a hypothetical regulated market situation where maybe people don't have unfair deals, but where we are disproportionately relying on the poor to meet needs for transplantation. An organ market by its very nature is going to incentivize donation by poorer people, which means that we shift primarily the burden of donation to a particular group in society. And that's particularly ethically problematic or unjust when we see that happening in societies where the poor are already disenfranchised from transplantation, where you see sort of unilateral flow of organs from the poor as donors to the wealthier as recipients. And finally, there are ethical concerns that relate to violations of human dignity, where people are instrumentalized, treated merely as means to the ends of other people, and where they are not recognized as having fundamental inherent value that is equal to that of other people. I think this occurs in the context of organ markets, particularly because when we start treating human organs merely as commodities, something that I might exchange for money or for a TV or a car, we start to think of people as being something less than a person who is inherently valuable. And then in a healthcare context, rather than thinking of the donor as a patient who is deserving of protection, care, and respect, they become a seller. And if you've ever bought something on the market and thought about how you treated the person who maybe sold you that good, think about how you treat a person who came to your house and did something to help you or gifted you something. You'd realize that we apply different ethical standards if we're talking to someone who is engaged in a commercial transaction as opposed to a more social relationship. So in healthcare, we see the organ sellers as something less than a patient. We are absolved, perhaps we might consider ourselves absolved of our ethical duties to protect and provide them with care because we have instead paid them. And that sort of seems to cancel those customary obligations. This is just a brief excerpt from the findings of one of the studies that came out in the mid-2000s showing the impact of selling a kidney on poorer people, in this case in Pakistan, just to really highlight what that black market looks like. 90% of the organ sellers in this particular study were illiterate. 69% of them were bonded laborers who were considered virtual slaves to their landlords. After they had sold their kidney, 88% reported no economic improvement in their lives. 98% reported deterioration in their general health status. So what then are the global ethical standards? The WHO established guiding principles on human cell tissue and organ transplantation as early as 1991 in response to the first reports of organ markets. And the latest version of those guiding principles was published in 2010. We see at least 3 principles that directly address the issue of trade and trafficking. Most obviously in Guiding Principle 5, where it is stated that cells, tissues, and organs should only be donated freely without any monetary payment or other reward of monetary value. Guiding Principle 7 notes that clinicians, healthcare organisations, health insurers should not be involved in activities where the organs that are used or have been procured or intended to be transplanted have been obtained through exploitation or coercion or of payment to the donor or the next of kin of a deceased donor. Guiding Principle 9 refers to the other end of the equation, that allocation of organs should not be guided by financial considerations. So you should not be able to buy an organ. Those standards are reflected in legislation around the world, in guidelines and policy. They're very much aligned with the Declaration of Istanbul that Sanjay will talk about. And implicit in all of the guiding principles is the principle of financial neutrality, which has now been specifically set out in the updated Declaration of Istanbul. This is the notion that whilst we believe that organ donation should not enrich people, they should not profit from it, it should not be financially incentivized, nor should people be financially harmed as a consequence of donation. Until very recent years, people were reluctant to pay any kind of money that would cover the costs associated with donation for fear that they might be violating the prohibition against trade. What that means is that many poorer people have been unable to become living organ donors because of the costs associated with donation, or many people who have donated have incurred financial harm. I think we're moving a lot more effectively now to actually covering costs, but we still have a long way to go. So is organ trafficking currently still a problem, or is this something that we no longer need to worry about given all the work that's been done? Back in those early days, there were many media reports, a lot of horrendous exposés, a lot of research, such as that study from Pakistan, showing both what was happening and the impact of the trade. In 2007, it was probably the visible peak of organ trade and transplant tourism. The WHO estimated, based on a literature review, that about 10% of solid organ transplants involve trafficking or transplant tourism. And many people will ask the Declaration of Istanbul, they'll ask the WHO, they'll ask everyone, so what's that figure now? And to be brutally honest, we don't really know. There hasn't been another literature review, I think primarily because there hasn't been much research that would actually inform even a literature review. So we can't say with any confidence what that number might be. But I think it is reasonable to assume that it is probably still very similar at 5 to 10%. That's not to say that we haven't had significant achievements. And I think when Sanjay talks about some of the efforts that have been made, we need to reflect on what the world might look like now if those efforts hadn't been made. I think we stopped the very rapidly increasing rates of trade. We've certainly discouraged many countries from introducing organ markets officially, but we still have plenty of things to worry about. This is just a very brief selection of media reports from countries in all regions of the world over the past few years, showing that there are constant cases of trafficking involving separate groups of people. So this is not just one organ trafficking ring that's operating internationally. These are individual institutions, groups of doctors usually, and organ brokers of varying kinds who work together to engage in trafficking. This is something that happens in Commonwealth nations, and it's really important to bear in mind that it doesn't happen exclusively in lower income countries. It could, and I'm sure does, happen from time to time in every country. Countries like Australia or Canada or the UK, the US are equally at risk. And there was obviously a recent case of attempted organ trafficking involving the UK and Nigeria that I think brings close to home just how much of a problem that can be anywhere. But of course, in lower income countries, there are larger populations of people who are vulnerable to trafficking. So it is, I think it does have a bigger impact, certainly in some countries and regions. Compared with the early surges in the 1990s and the early 2000s, organ trafficking does look different. You can no longer go online and find hospitals advertising that they will provide you with a paid donor. Organ trafficking now seems to happen primarily under cover of legitimate donation and transplantation programs. So you do see social media brokering of sales. They're not always readily easy to find if you're a researcher. But if you look at the media case reports of these trafficking rings that are busted, so to speak, in each case you find that there have been several transplants that have actually occurred that were marked as legal, ethical, non-commercial donation and transplant cases. There's falsification of identity and relationships that really enable trafficking to occur undercover. So just some take-home points from me, and I hope to have the time to expand on some of my points perhaps in the discussion. If we really want to progress towards self-sufficiency in organ transplantation, being able to meet people's needs for transplant everywhere in the world, we need to maximize public trust and participation in living and deceased donation opportunities. To do that, we need equitable access to donation and transplantation, respect and care for donors, and public confidence that every potential donor, whether they are living or deceased, will be recognized as an individual who is inherently valuable and not there simply to be exploited when possible. Trade in organs undermines respect for the fundamental ethical values that underpin the world's best, the most successful donation and transplantation programs. Everywhere where we see the commodification of human organs, we see the prioritization of profits over people. And that applies in the few examples we have internationally of legal organ markets, not simply in the black market. In current organ trafficking, the financial conflicts of interest that are inherent to organ markets underpin the bad practices that we see. The commercial conflicts of interest on the part of healthcare institutions and doctors that drive people to overlook or to actively support donation and transplantation that involves payment. So we need more work to strengthen protections and address trafficking in all countries. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dominique. I don't know, are we going to take questions now or go on to the next presentation?
We normally take it to the end after we finish both the presentation, David.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Dominique. As usual, excellent presentation. Prioritization over people. I mean, this webinar is so important for us at Tribute to Life Commonwealth because, the whole principles of Commonwealth Tribute to Life is based on exchanging ethical practices between Commonwealth countries and trying to do capacity building in countries which don't have a transplant program or which are struggling with transplants. So that's why, I think Dale was looking forward to be in this webinar, but I think he's stuck with some other meeting. But again, thank you, Dominique, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. Dale has already, I think, put some questions in the chat window. So I want to invite our next speaker, Dr. Sanjay Nagral from India. I have known Sanjay for, I think, more than 25 years, ever since I returned to India in 1995. I have known of him, and then I've met him many times. Sanjay is a surgical gastroenterology and hepatopancreatobiliary surgeon and liver transplant surgeon at Mumbai at the Jaslok Hospital. He was nominated to the Executive Council of the Declaration of Custodian Istanbul Group and has now been appointed as the co-chair for the year 2021-22. He is also the co-chair for the Ethics Task Force for Asian Society of Transplantation. He is a publisher and a member of the editorial board of Indian Journal of Medical Ethics and chairperson of the Forum for Medical Ethics. He co-edited a book on healers or predators, healthcare corruption in India, which was published in 2018. He has over 120 publications in index journals, has edited 2 surgical textbooks, contributed to 6 textbook chapters. He served also as chairman and joint secretary for the liver committee of the Zonal Transplant Coordination Committee of Mumbai, which does organ allocation. Currently, he is the director of the Department of Surgical Gastroenterology at Jaslok Hospital in Mumbai. And Sanjay is going to talk to us on the role of DICG, the Declaration of Istanbul Custodian Group, and perhaps also the responsibilities of healthcare professionals in upholding the ethical principles preventing organ trafficking. So over to you, Sanjay. Please share your screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shroff. So do you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, and can you see my slide now?
Yeah, if you make it on full screen, yeah, please. Yeah. Thanks, Sanjay.
Okay, so first of all, on a slightly formal note, thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts on this subject. And of course, my talk follows the usual absolutely on the dot accurate clinical talk by Dominique Martin, which is a hard act to follow. I sort of even followed her as the co-chair of the DICG, which is also a hard act to follow. So I'm a little bit at a disadvantage. But I thought that I will try and focus today on 2 areas. The first, of course, is what can transplant professionals do, and in that talk a little bit about what the DICG is and what it attempts to do. And towards the end of my talk, I will also share with you some of the challenges that we have experienced in India, because after all, this is about experience sharing, and India is in a peculiar position right now and as an emerging transplant power, but also facing a whole host of challenges. So I thought I'll just share some of those thoughts with you. So if any of you has a doubt about whether I belong to a country from the Commonwealth, here's my life story. This is a school which I went to in Bombay at that time, called the King George High School. This name is changed now, by the way. I went and trained for many years as an undergraduate, postgraduate, and then on the staff of this large municipal hospital in Mumbai called the King Edward VII Memorial Hospital. By the way, this name has not been changed. There was a lot of attempt to change this name, but it apparently King Edward VII was a benevolent king, and so they decided to keep the name. And finally, I did my transplant training in London at what it looked like this at that time. It was the King's College Hospital in the south of London. And therefore, if any of you have doubts about whether I belong to the Commonwealth group of nations, please put them to rest. I looked at a map of the Commonwealth when I thought I was preparing for this talk. And I mean, the first time I looked at it after school geography, to be honest. What exactly is the Commonwealth? Which are the countries? And again, it's very clear to me that when we talk about global transplantation, and we talk very often about ethics, sets of principles, we realize when we start looking at countries that there is so much variety and inequity. And I think that the same thing applies to the Commonwealth, that you have on one hand, of course, the United Kingdom, the mother of the Commonwealth. You have Canada, you have Australia, but you also have South Asia, you have India, Pakistan, and you have lots of countries in South Africa. So really speaking, although the Commonwealth is a group by a certain history, but it is extremely variable in the types of countries. And this actually is seen in the global world transplant order. And this is the famous map from the GODT, which shows us that there is a huge variation in the way countries offer the transplantation services to their citizens. Dominic has already spoken about the various definitions, what constitutes trade and trafficking. And really speaking, I've just put down a lot of points on this slide, which I'm not going to go through in one by one. But I just want to point out that sometimes trade and trafficking hotspot, if you identify a country or a region of the world, is actually an indicator of many other things. Of course, it's an indicator of poor access to transplantation across the world, but it is often an indicator of a certain permissiveness to both unethical and unjust healthcare practices. It is an indicator that there are vulnerable populations in that part of the world. Also, that the regulatory systems in those countries are weak. Recently, we have noticed that it is an indicator of areas of the world which are torn apart by conflict, by migration, etc. So social disorder is obviously reflects in increased trade and trafficking. But what I want to focus today, and I think we need to all as transplant professionals periodically remind ourselves, is that it is also an indicator of willing actors in the transplant ecosystem, who either due to conflict of interest, pressure, or due to sometimes even clear support to the idea of organ markets. And I'm aware, and I think we need to understand that globally, there is also a clear-cut school of thought, which says that a market in organs, perhaps an organized, regulated market is a good idea. It is also now an emerging indicator, and I shall come to India later part of my talk, of an increasing private sector in transplantation, a profit-driven sector, and perhaps countries which are projecting themselves as destinations for medical tourism. Now, here's a sort of look at all the global ethics guidance that we have. And of course, I'm going to soon plunge into discussing the Declaration of Istanbul. And this is what happened. So you had decades ago, 3 decades ago, rampant trade in organs. And I belong to that part of the world, by the way, which had a very shameful history here, where you could buy, you could sort of buy kidneys pretty easily in a very mainstream manner. So two big organizations, the Transplantation Society and the International Society of Nephrology, took this initiative and brought together, and this is important, it brought together not just transplant clinicians, but government officials, social scientists. I think that was that was important, and ethicists. So this was a very diverse group which got together from across the world. And incidentally, the Declaration of Istanbul describes itself as building on the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think this is the key to it, that this is perhaps finally, as we dissect out trade and trafficking, and I think Dominic also referred to this. Basically, we are talking about a violation of the rights of individuals who are vulnerable. And this is, of course, the picture, and I think Dominic is somewhere there. And this is the mission of the Declaration of Istanbul, which I will not read out, but it does, just point out that although it says it is focused on trafficking, transplant tourism, but it also attempted to look at transplant commercialism, which is a very broad area to cover. And off and on, we do go into areas which are not strictly, will not fit into the area of either trafficking or trade, and maybe I'll mention some of those. So then this group decided to put together not just a declaration, and this is rather unique. There are declarations galore across the world, all sorts of, there are all sorts of global declarations. But I think the key contribution of the then group was to actually establish a custodian group, the DICG, which was supposed to take forward the Declaration of Istanbul. And I think this is the key step they took, because what the DICG has attempted to do, and we can also, of course, debate its success, but actually update, take forward, apply the DOI to contemporary issues, and respond to everyday challenges. And I'll show you some examples of that. And this is Dominic's piece on the 2018 sort of update on the declaration. And I think this was an important contribution because it attempted to clarify some of the emerging areas. It attempted perhaps to even course correct a little and even sort of expand on some of the definitional challenges that existed in the 2008 edition of the DOI. And I'm not going to sort of read through the DOI or sort of talk about all the principles. It's all there on the website, and those of you who would be interested should certainly look at it. It's not a very big document, but one of the things that the DOI emphasizes is which is what I've headlined here, is the fact that whilst there are many parties and many social organizations and institutions which need to look at trafficking, one of the key sectors who should take the lead is healthcare professionals, healthcare institutions, and transplant professionals. And I think that is why that is what I'm going to try and focus on. So just to say what's unique about the DOI, I've already said some of these things, but it's a global consensus ethics statement. It supports the need for transplantation and self-sufficiency. So it's not just focusing on the trading and unethical transplantation, but it's also attempting to promote self-sufficiency. It has, I think, a key instrument of peer pressure, because it has connections to global professional organizations, the TTS ISN, and a large number of global endorsing organizations. I think past 200 now. So many transplant professional bodies across the world have endorsed the DOI, and we are in quite regular touch with some of them, and some of them do come to us with challenges in their countries. So it's actually also a guide to regular action. Now, how does the DICG promote the DOI? What does it actually do? So here's a list, and again, I perhaps will not go through the list, but it does many things. It campaigns. It is involved in advocacy in a big way, and I think one success. Now, there is some recent debate again about China, but certainly one success of the DICG was to engage and put pressure on the Chinese to stop the use of death row prisoners as donors. I think it's one of the important successes of the DICG. But the DICG also has intervened directly in specific instances of trafficking, has lobbied with governments, has actually stopped governments from going down certain routes. So another example, in about 5 years ago, the government of India brought out a document which was supposed to create a sort of scheme to give financial incentives to families of deceased donors. And the DICG campaigned a lot on this with the government, with other bodies, put a lot of pressure from international groups, and that document was withdrawn. Of course, there were a lot of local organizations which also supported it. So I think the point one is making is that the DICG has actually bridged the gap between the DOI as a conceptual ethics statement to its application in day-to-day practice. The DICG also does constantly tries to look at contemporary issues. So we, for example, a few months ago did this webinar. As I mentioned, we have seen a spike in transplantation, unethical transplantation in countries. There is a lot of conflict and migration. The DICG has come out with a course which is up on its website. It regularly writes, either in the form of formal publications like this, brings out statements in peer-reviewed journals, and a lot of this is utilized by other agencies to support ethical transplantation. The DICG and its office bearers write publicly, and I think this is very important, that especially in countries where sometimes there can tend to be silence from a large number of transplant professionals, publicly writing about some of these challenges and unethical acts. So here's, for example, myself, Dominic, and Vivek Jha writing in a publication in India about what I mentioned, the families of deceased donors being rewarded. Or recently, myself and two of my colleagues from India writing about a specific issue or a specific scandal that broke out in the northeastern state of Assam in India. So publicly writing and sort of taking a stand against trading has been one of the areas that the DICG has done. So I think the engagement with national professional organizations, and I say this because in this group, there are perhaps individuals and professional organizations from across Commonwealth countries who are listening or are represented. That I think the peer pressure is an effective tool. In many LMICs, regional and national professional organizations actually have significant influence on government. They punch well above their weight. Doctors have a lot of influence. So we can influence policy if we wish to or if we want to. On the other hand, we know that individual professionals in many countries can be victims of unethical state policy and are actually also instruments in institutional policies. And therefore, one of the jobs of any professional organization is to actually protect those who are speaking out against trading and against unethical acts. Of course, we need to recognize that professional organizations can also develop vested interests, and I'll come back to that a little later towards the end of my talk. So I thought, and as I said, that I should look at briefly before I end India. And India is an example of what may be happening in the rest of South Asia, and perhaps to an extent what happens in the global South. So we know that in many parts of the world, there are major basic public health challenges. And therefore, actually, transplantation is very low on the agenda of everyone's agenda. But what is also happening is that there is a weakening of the public sector and a simultaneous rise of the private sector. And this is very different from the NHS. This is, of course, very different from many parts of the Western world. And people are actually paying for transplantation out of pocket. So transplantation in some parts of the world, especially the South Asia, is an extremely costly proposition. So what is therefore happening is that on one hand, it's a low priority area, but on the other hand, because of the costs, it is perceived as an elite project. Healthcare in many parts of the world, trust in the system is very low, and that indirectly impacts on donation rates. So the changing nature of healthcare in many countries, and certainly in India, where you have for-profit organizations, you have global capital coming in, and there is a certain globalization, but this globalization is very different from globalization of knowledge. This is globalization of capital, which is actually setting up hospitals, and those countries then set up hospitals in other countries. And the reason I say this is because when we talk about travel, when we talk about tourism, we need to keep this particular aspect in mind as a background, and this is very different from what may be happening in parts like Europe. So actually the Indian law, and Dr. Shroff is one of the individuals in India whose knowledge on all this is encyclopedic and has been one of the prime movers. But the Indian law actually is very interesting. It was a response to it attempted to do two things together in the same law. So it actually tried to crack down upon the organ trade on one hand by sort of a series of measures, but it also in the same law legalized brainstem death. And therefore, this by itself has created a very interesting situation, which I'll come to in a minute. But India has progressed. The numbers have gone up. The deceased donations have gone up. India, by the way, now is supposed to be the third largest number of transplants in the world. But having said that, when you break it down to per million population, it will be extremely low. So we should not be gung-ho about just isolated numbers. But I think what we have also seen is challenges coming up. And the reason I mentioned these here is because in this, there may be lessons for other LMICs who are part of the Commonwealth. So your health systems determine how it's going to go. So here is a table from a piece we published in Transplantation last year, which connected transplantation in India with the health systems. And what I just wanted to look at is the percentage of transplants that are in the public sector, in the government hospital, which is the minority. And liver transplantation, which I am involved with, currently probably about 3 to 5% are performed in the public sector, and the rest are all in the private sector, which gets its own challenges. So here's a quick look before I end on what are the challenges that have emerged. So medical tourism in a country like India is actually a matter of national pride. It's revenue. It's revenue for the hospitals. It's indirect revenue for the government. But when you talk of travel for transplant and transplant tourism, it's all, there is a gray area there. So of course, people need to travel for transplant. Of course, there are lots of countries around us and also in the world where there is no transplantation and people are going to travel. Non-resident Indians return to India for transplant because they are sometimes the waiting list in other countries is low. Live donor transplantation is not well left. But travel for transplant can be a cover for unethical transplantation, for tourism. And finally, of course, it creates a public perception that transplantation is about foreigners and further reducing the trust in the system. So disease donation in India, and Dr. Shroff is, of course, one of the leaders in pushing disease donation in India, did many things. But, it has done something very interesting, and it's again something for LMICs to look at, which is that it actually also opened up issues around end-of-life care. And I think when you have systems which are porous, when you have poorly regulated systems, this is what can happen. And unfortunately, when such things happen, when allocation criteria are jumped, it reduces the trust in the system. So on one hand, you have individuals donating organs, but on the other hand, sometimes the system games it. Finally, here's something very interesting. Dr. Shroff wrote, and I wrote a response. So we are currently in a strange situation where we recognize brain death as a part of the Transplant Act. But when somebody is not donating, we generally, in most states, with some exceptions, do not disconnect the ventilator. So it seems that we recognize brainstem death only for the sake of donation, which has created huge challenges. And these are some of the problems I thought I must share with you from India. So some closing thoughts. It's an unequal world, as I said, and I think it's a joint global responsibility. If we claim that we are a global world and a global body, and so also in transplantation, and so also the Commonwealth, we must equally attempt to address the inequity in transplantation. It is still very much seen as an elite project in many countries of the world. This is obvious, this we all know, but it will continue to drive either attempts to buy or incentivize, or even worse, coerce donors. And a lot of local hierarchies, cultures, vulnerabilities matter here. For example, in many countries, there is women who are going to donate much more than men. The poor, of course, are going to donate more. And whilst deceased donation will reduce or can reduce, but it will not eliminate the organ trade, because if your healthcare system doesn't adjust to the specific ethical challenges of transplantation, even deceased donation, there'll be attempts to subvert it. I think I missed my last point there. This is that whilst countries will pass laws and global bodies will pass guidelines, and we have lots of them, I think one of the key points that I have sort of attempted to bring out is that ultimately it is professionals, because transplantation cannot be performed without the involvement of at least some professionals and their organizations in country, who will need to locate what is their moral compass, what is their social compass, and if they feel that it's a violation of rights, and if they feel that this is not good for the progress of transplantation, we need to act. So that's what I had to say, and thank you for your attention.
And thank you so much, Sanjay. Very well presented, thought-provoking presentation. Time is short. I wish we would have more time, because I think this kind of presentations, both from Dominique and Sanjay, requires a better discussion. We would perhaps can spend 20 minutes. We'll be about 10 minutes late, but I think it requires at least some questions to be answered. There are a few in the chat window. I will start off with the first question from there's a question from, I think, Dale, who's talking about Iran. He says Iran is typically said to allow for a limited financial market for kidneys. Thoughts? I'll ask Dominique, perhaps. Dominique may be aware of what's happening in Iran, although they've increased the disease donation number, but I'm not sure what's happening to their market with kidney trade, where the financial incentive is given by the government, I think,
So Iran has had a so-called regulated market for several years now. There haven't, to my knowledge, been any recent reports in terms of the outcomes or experiences of people who sell their kidneys in Iran, but there have been some studies in the past which have generally indicated many of the same problems that are present in illegal markets in other countries are replicated in the regulated market in Iran. There's a government price that is fixed, but because that isn't effective as an incentive, particularly as inflation progresses, people have co-payments effectively. So there's fluctuating prices. The people who tend to sell their kidneys tend to be have health problems, illiteracy. They're poor, and their outcomes, both physically and socially, are generally again poor. But they are, as you say, developing an more effective deceased donation program in some parts of the country. I'm not really well aware of how equitable access to transplant is in Iran. There are significant financial barriers, I believe, for many people. So they have many challenges. And I think the example there shows that it has not been effective in addressing the organ shortage, which original claims and people who are pro-market, particularly in the United States, were sort of fond of saying Iran had no waiting list because they had an effective market. In fact, they literally had no waiting list. So there was no measurement of need.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marty. I'm not too sure if the increase in disease donation has brought down this, this market. I'm not very sure about that, but we don't have much data, as you said. Do you think the numbers have come down from what it was before? Because not much is being spoken about this, now.
I couldn't say, but I doubt it. I suspect that the demand for kidney transplants is so huge that there will be enough people who need organs that if they can afford to pay for a seller and a seller is available, that may happen.
David, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. No, it's more of a follow-up. I mean, I think I'm more of an expert in deceased donation than on living donation, but I'm interested in the intersection between them to a large extent. And obviously, a lot of the discussion is about money, but I know that in living donation, social capital is also very important as well, like your social networks and so on. And the only thing I've actually looked at specifically, and it's kind of a fringe issue, is the intersection between deceased donation and kidney donor chains, where, for example, there's a donor chain, but maybe there's someone who their relative donates an organ, they don't receive an organ, so they're an empty recipient. And it's been suggested, I think some countries do enable prioritization for deceased donor organs for those people. And to me, I hadn't thought of it in that context. I mean, I had looked at that, but isn't that edging into organ trade territory if you do grant prioritization in cases like that? Because the people they have contributed an organ through the donor chain, but they're able to do so because they have someone who's able to donate. People who are socially isolated don't have that. So in terms of justice, it seems problematic to reward someone, even though it's not a financial reward, even though they've made a contribution. So I just wondered if Dominique or Sanjay had any thoughts on kind of fringe issues like that and whether they possibly edge into ethically dubious organ trade territory.
Yeah, you want to take that? And then I'll ask Dominique.
I mean, I've thought about these things, but to be honest, I think what we often do in sort of these creative policies to, number one, promote donation, number two, perhaps reward indirectly deceased donor families, put them high up on, let's say, put them high up on the list if one of them needs an organ, etc. It's essentially an attempt to push donation rates, but we may be crossing boundaries. Having said that, I am in a situation where the day-to-day challenges so much that we really don't think of the fringe right now. The fringe is sort of, but maybe this is more of a challenge for Western countries.
Dominique?
I think that generally speaking, the priority point systems in their varying kinds don't constitute trafficking as such because there isn't a financial gain. That isn't, though, as you've said, to preclude other ethical concerns. From my perspective, living donors who receive priority, if they then develop a need, say, for a kidney transplant, I think arguably that's a matter of justice to give them priority because they're at a higher risk of needing that transplant because they've donated. But I agree that some of the systems like the Israeli system, where the more relatives you have or the bigger your social connections, there can be concerns about inequities.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Another question from Dale. You want to take that, David? Have you got that question on your chat window?
Yeah, sure. I've got Dale's, but we've also got 3 questions from regular participants as well.
Go ahead.
So maybe go ahead with Sanjay. So just a kind of general question.
Yeah, absolutely.
What could be the best way to prevent organ trafficking in any country? So it's a wide question. Answers of 1 sentence, please.
I will leave that to. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay. I was about to point to Dominic. So one line answer. Increase access, increase the numbers of transplants. What else can one say? That'll be the most.
Yeah. I think the most effective will be to get transplant professionals doing the right thing. If you can stop transplant professionals from overlooking trafficking or facilitating it by having adequate safeguards, which I think relates to maybe another question we have there, that will stop it because we're not going to eradicate global poverty. We're not going to, until we start bioengineering those organs, we're not going to have a surplus supply of organs. So the most effective thing right now, I think, would be to get transplant professionals to be more ethical.
And that actually brings us back, sorry, Sunil, to Dale's second question. So as part of that professionalism aspect for clinicians in transplantation, is that raising concerns and going to the authorities, going to the police if necessary, or are there more subtle? So can you raise concerns without whistleblowing, as it were? Sanjay?
Yeah. I, as I referred to in my talk, I think transplant professionals whistleblowing is rare in my part of the world. I'm aware that there are individuals who in the past have been quite courageous, but as I said, it's not common. On the other hand, it seems to me that if you take the recent example of the Nigerian traveling to the UK, the first, it was brought to the notice of the public by a transplant professional at the Royal Free Hospital. So I think there needs to be a mechanism, and that's what I was referring to when I was talking about the responsibility of professional organizations to actually support those who blow the whistle. Whether there are such mechanisms in place, I'm not sure. Certainly, I don't think in my part of the world there are such mechanisms in place. In fact, there is a chance that you may be isolated if you blow the whistle too much. But in some countries where the consensus is much more, perhaps.
Yeah, well, thanks. And I think it's the same. Just generally, it depends on the general culture and context and consensus in the country how protected you will be if you do raise concerns in any of those contexts. Sorry, Sunil, do you want to do another of the question?
There's one question on training. Is it your opinion on solid organ transplant being performed by only trained surgeons with team? Importance of trained professionals in conducting transplants. How do you monitor this one? Not very sure what he's trying to say. But it's more about in some places it's about trained surgeons rather than a trained person performing transplant. And how do you monitor that? I'm not too sure whether that. Sanjay, do you think that this is happening in many places?
I think I understand what perhaps he's trying to say, that there is sometimes a trend for people who do not have the necessary adequate training to claim to be transplant surgeons, and I think it's much better policed in many other parts of the world. Having said that, there are parts of the world where there is a shortage of trained transplant professionals. So therefore, informal training or limited training is perhaps an option to very, very prolonged and very monitored training. So we've seen, we've gone through time and period, at least in India, where individuals who had limited training were performing transplantation. But now I think things are changing because there are many more opportunities for solid training. In the rest of the world, I think it is always much more structured with minimum. I think it's about health systems. If health systems are strong, they monitor all these things automatically.
I mean, emerging countries which are just starting transplant program are always going to have some struggle with the trained kind of manpower. And perhaps there's some lessons to be learned from what we went through in India on training and how we, although law is very specific on training that, to get they need to have minimum of 3 years experience in a transplant program before they'll be recognized to be a transplant surgeon. But that doesn't prevent, of course, trainees from doing it, obviously. And sometimes you can be mentored, under someone who is already senior, and you can do it that way. But I think emerging countries will have that challenge as we went through. And there's no easy answer to that, perhaps. I don't know. Again, it also becomes a regulatory issue to some extent.
So there's two more questions that are kind of linked. So maybe Dominique could try and about specific mechanisms. So you've maybe looked at them, Dominique. One of them about, is there any mechanism for linking up information on the supposed close relationship between donor and recipient between jurisdictions? I suspect the answer is no, but I don't know. And the second one, would a clinical quality registry reporting help? So any thoughts on those, Dominique?
So for the first one, no, there isn't currently any formal mechanism unless, you're suspecting a crime and your, say, federal police in Australia would contact their equivalents in the other country, which sometimes happens. But I don't think that's going to deal with sort of your day-to-day cases. Different countries have different, and within countries, even within Australia, say there's a lot of diversity in terms of how living donor and transplant recipients are screened. What the standards are, for example, for checking the nature of a relationship or assessing for fraud. And I know Dr. Shroff has had some experience with this in the Indian context as well. So people have different skill sets, a different awareness, more or less motivation to actually scrutinize documentation and verify those relationships. And there are often financial interests, time pressures, resource limitations, which can make it really difficult to do. If you are a clinician and you have a case, and particularly if it involves international patients, it's a lot more difficult to assess, document relationships. There will be clinicians in other countries that you can contact at least for advice in terms of what might be normal, and that can be helpful and has been helpful in many cases. So the DICG is a good source of support if you're ever in that position. Kylie Hurst's suggestion about a clinical quality registry, I think, also ties in with someone else's comment about how could we audit listing. If we were to say tomorrow we want to have public data about all the details of individual cases that would enable us maybe to spot trafficking, that won't happen. But I think there are definitely mechanisms and examples that can be developed or adapted from existing registry tools in various countries, which would be really helpful in terms of shedding light on patterns of whether that be patterns of the types of donors and recipients or that people have, whether all the donors are lost to follow up at this particular transplant program, things that would be potential indicators that what's happening in particular areas or particular clinicians perhaps maybe needs closer scrutiny. So I think anything that does that relates to registries of some kind that is transparent, publicly available, and that helps to protect individuals who may have difficulty, quite serious and genuine risks to themselves if they do whistleblow, I think that's a really good strategy as well. So I really like those suggestions. But I think each country would have to think what would work best in their context.
Dominique, you also said that, I think you, or I'm not sure, Sanjay, in the slide mentioned that there could be a registry to monitor organ trafficking. Is that still on cards? And how you plan to do that?
It's something that's being worked on at the DICG, but in order to do that effectively, we first need to study and get a better feel for how people might engage with it, what might be barriers to them engaging with the registry. And I think, again, that's going to be one of many suites of tools that we have.
One last question before Dale is also here in the room. So I want to invite him for the closing comments. But before we go, I think I should take this question. What are the protection available in India for the medical personnel who are inadvertently caught in the case of possible trade? Sanjay, do you have an answer for that?
Right. So yes, and I think I know why you chose that question. But so the first thing is, I think that's important. We need to focus on that because if it is a genuine case of somebody who is working in an institution who is absolutely not involved, but just a part of a team, and gets caught up in a case because somebody has impersonated or defrauded the system, as you know, there has been some. Currently, the only protection for them is for number one, the peers, the same peers to fight it for them, including the organizations, and Dr. Shroff is right now the president of the ISOT. And I think we are up against a public image, unfortunately, in India, which is partly judgmental, but I think there is a history to it. Having said this, my take on this is that whilst there will be cases where people are inadvertently sort of caught up, but quite often, if it is repeat, especially when there are repeated cases from a certain center, it is not as advertent as it seems. So this is my view, at least from the Indian perspective.
Thank you. I think Dale, are you there, available in the room? Yeah, Dale is there. Dale, do you want
Yeah,
to comment? David, if you don't mind, shall I ask Dale to give the closing comments? I know you're...
Well, it really just falls on me to just thank everyone, particularly today, for just another brilliant webinar. You know, we have been saving the best to last, and this was such an important webinar for this Tribute to Life project. So thank you to David and Sunil for being our chairs, and Dominic and Sanjay particularly for giving us absolutely fascinating and important penultimate webinar. We have one more to go, which will mark the 20th since our launch, which is actually going to be on Transplant Sport. It's Thursday, 12 o'clock UK time. And then on the inaugural ceremony, which will mark the start of the Memorandum of Understanding between our Commonwealth countries. And I think we're looking at 42 to 44 Commonwealth countries out of 54 are now joining us, which is just absolutely amazing. That's the 22nd July. It's evening UK time, which will be a bit unpleasant for people. But we will be live streaming on YouTube the actual session, and you're welcome to watch on catch up. But that will mark 5 years, the start of our MOU. So thank you all for today for joining, and particularly our chairs and speakers, and see some of you on Thursday as we mark just the beginning as we move forward in this working together across the Commonwealth to do, unethical transplantation, stopping it, but also actually growing just the actual numbers as we heard today. That's equally important. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dale.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That was great. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dominique. Thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you.